The gate opened at 6:30 in the morning. A German prisoner walked out. Then another. Then another. They weren't being marched under rifles. There was no armored convoy waiting outside. No military truck. No line of armed soldiers. There was a farmer. A middle-aged American farmer sitting behind the wheel of an ordinary pickup truck, waiting at the gate. The prisoners climbed into the back. Their clothes were marked with 2 letters. PW. Prisoner of war. The farmer closed the tailgate, started the engine, and drove away. No armed escort followed. No guard sat beside him. The truck simply disappeared down a country road while several German soldiers sat in the back, heading toward an American farm. And this wasn't some isolated mistake. It happened across the United States, again and again and again. By 1944, hundreds of thousands of German prisoners were being held inside American camps. Many had been captured in North Africa. Some had fought against American troops in Tunisia. Others had been captured in Italy, France, and later in Europe. Now they were thousands of miles from the battlefield, behind barbed wire. And America had a problem. The country was fighting a global war. Millions of American men had been drafted. Factories were demanding workers. The military needed soldiers. And American farms needed something else. Hands, because crops don't wait for wars to end. And in 1943, America made a decision that would produce one of the strangest sights of the entire war. German prisoners would go to work, not inside factories, not building weapons, but harvesting America's crops. And sometimes, the farmer himself would come to collect them. By 1943, the American countryside was running short of workers. The draft had removed millions of young men from farms. War industries were paying attractive wages. Factories were producing aircraft, tanks, trucks, ammunition, and ships. Everywhere the government looked, workers were needed. But the farms had the same problem every autumn. The crops were ready, and there weren't enough people to harvest them. At the same time, American POW camps were filling with German soldiers. The numbers eventually reached hundreds of thousands. Under the rules governing prisoners of war, enlisted prisoners could be required to perform labor. That was not directly connected to military production. Agricultural work qualified, so the Army began establishing smaller branch camps throughout farming regions. Instead of keeping every prisoner at a huge military installation, the government moved groups of them closer to where the labor was needed. The arrangement was surprisingly simple. A farmer needed workers. The Army provided prisoners. The farmer paid the government. The prisoner received compensation through the camp system, and the harvest moved forward. In some places, prisoners picked fruit. In others, they harvested sugar beets. They cut crops, loaded trucks, worked orchards, cleared fields, performed the exhausting seasonal labor that American farms could no longer accomplish with their normal workforce. But there was an obvious question. Who was supposed to guard them? Because these men were still enemy soldiers. They were prisoners. And now America was putting them outside the wire, sometimes miles away from the camp, sometimes in the middle of open farmland, and sometimes with remarkably few guards. The American Army had a manpower problem of its own. Every soldier assigned to guard prisoners was a soldier who couldn't be sent overseas, and by 1944 the Army desperately needed men. The best available soldiers were being sent toward Europe and the Pacific, so prisoner camps often relied on personnel who were less suited for combat. Older soldiers, limited service personnel, men recovering from wounds, men who had medical restrictions preventing overseas deployment. The mathematics were brutally simple. If a soldier could fight, the Army wanted him fighting. If he couldn't, he might end up guarding German prisoners, and that created an unusual situation. A group of German soldiers could leave a prison compound in the morning, travel into the countryside, work an entire day, and return in the evening. Sometimes the guard presence was minimal. Sometimes the farmer himself transported them. From the outside, it could look almost unbelievable. American civilians watched enemy soldiers riding through their towns. Some people were furious. Their sons were fighting overseas. Their neighbors were buying war bonds. And here were German soldiers being driven around American farmland. But there was another reason the system worked. Running away was harder than it looked. A prisoner wearing PW clothing was obvious. He had no American identity papers. He had little or no useful American money. He didn't know the roads. He didn't know the language well enough to disappear easily. And even if he escaped the camp, where exactly was he supposed to go? America was enormous. That was both its greatest advantage and its greatest prison. A German prisoner could walk away from the farm, but he couldn't simply walk back to Germany. Then came the statistic that made the entire system look different. During the war, hundreds of thousands of German prisoners passed through American custody, and thousands escaped or attempted to escape. But compared with the total prisoner population, the percentage was remarkably small. The Army documented the numbers, and in its own reporting it used them to defend the system. Because the escape rate was surprisingly low, most prisoners who escaped were caught quickly. Some simply wandered away. Others left because they were bored. Some wanted to experience the outside world for a few hours. And some eventually returned voluntarily. There were more serious attempts. There were tunnels. There were disguises. There were plans to reach railroads or cities. But the vast majority never became long-term escapes. The geography of America worked against them. Imagine being a German soldier in Nebraska. You escape from a farm. You have no car, no identification, limited money, a foreign accent, and thousands of miles between you and home. Even if you make it onto a train, where are you going? New York? Chicago? California? Mexico? And then what? The war had created the prison, but America itself created the walls. Still, the program wasn't universally accepted. Some Americans didn't want German prisoners anywhere near their communities. Newspapers received complaints. Workers objected to foreign prisoners taking agricultural jobs. Some labor organizations argued that prisoners should not be used, while American workers were available. But the farms had another argument. The crops were ready, and crops couldn't wait for political arguments. By 1944, something strange was happening across rural America. A German soldier who had once carried a rifle against American troops might now be standing in an American orchard, picking apples. Another might be harvesting sugar beets. Another might be loading hay. Another might be working beside an American farmer who had a son fighting somewhere in Europe. The contradiction was enormous. But on the farm, the work was the work. Some communities eventually became familiar with the prisoners. Farmers learned their names. Prisoners learned American expressions. Children saw them working in fields. And sometimes relationships continued after the war. One of the most remarkable examples involved a German prisoner named William Oberdick. During the war, he was held at a camp in Nebraska and sent to work in the orchards around Nebraska City. He eventually returned to Germany after the war. But years later, he came back to America. This time, he wasn't behind barbed wire. He became an American citizen, and eventually he owned an orchard. The same country that had once held him as an enemy soldier became the place where he built his life. That story captures something unusual about the American POW system. The prisoners entered America as enemies. Many left as people who had experienced a country they had previously known only through propaganda and war, and some never completely forgot what they had seen. But the system eventually came to an end. Germany surrendered. The shooting stopped. The prisoners still had to be sent home, and the farms still had work to do. The last German prisoners didn't simply disappear the moment Germany surrendered. Repatriation took time. Some prisoners remained involved in agricultural labor even after the European war had ended because America's manpower shortage hadn't instantly disappeared. The harvest still had to be collected. Fields still had to be worked. And American soldiers were still overseas. Eventually, the camps closed. The prisoners were transported away. The fences came down. The guard towers disappeared. The temporary buildings were dismantled. The branch camps faded back into the American countryside. In many places, almost nothing remained. Maybe a concrete foundation. Maybe an old photograph. Maybe a story passed down through a family. But for several years during World War II, something extraordinary had existed in the middle of ordinary America. German soldiers had been captured on battlefields thousands of miles away, then transported across the Atlantic, then placed behind barbed wire, and finally driven out into American farmland to help harvest the crops, sometimes guarded by only a handful of soldiers, sometimes transported by civilians. And according to the Army's own statistics, the vast majority didn't run. That may be the strangest part of the story. America didn't need to build higher fences. It didn't need to place soldiers behind every prisoner. The country was simply too large. The prisoners were too far from home, and most of them understood that escaping the camp was not the same thing as escaping America. So every morning the gate opened. The truck arrived. The prisoners climbed inside, and the former enemies of the United States disappeared down another American country road to pick America's crops. Then at sunset, they came back. The war had put them behind the wire, but it was America's enormous distance from the rest of the world that kept most of them there.